Good morning, or good evening, or good afternoon. Welcome everyone to Network 2020's discussion about alliances and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Courtney Dogger, and I am the president of Network 2020. It's a pleasure to have this discussion with two wonderful experts today. Just as some background before we get into the topic, Network 2020, we are a New York-based nonprofit, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy community. We do this in a number of ways. We run briefings like this. We do original courses. We just ran a deep dive on China. We're running research in Tunisia. We're doing an entrepreneurship program for fellows from Bosnia. So we do all sorts of different activities. To find out more, please do go to our website or follow us on social media. We are trying to get higher numbers of subscribers on all our social media platforms. So we would really appreciate your help in doing that. So before I introduce our two panelists, I just wanted to say a few words about the topic today. So I wanted to have this conversation because during many of the discussions that we have had over the past few months at Network 2020, the topic and the importance of alliances in general, but particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, have kept coming up as something that's really critical. And this is in particular since the Biden administration took over in the United States. And so we really wanted to dig more into what that means and what that looks like and what those structures are that are in place and how they're growing and changing. So I'm delighted that we have two wonderful panelists for us today. We have, first of all, we have Professor Gordon Flake, and he is the founding Chief Executive Officer of the Perth USAsia Centre at the University of Western Australia. So he can talk about the view from Australia, among other things. And then we also have Dr. Eva Pejsova, and she is the Senior Japan Fellow at the Center for Security, Diplomacy, and Strategy of the Brussels School of Governance, and an Associate Fellow at the French Fondation pour la Recherche Strategique. So apologies for my French this early in the morning. So welcome both of you, and thank you for being here with us today. I usually like to start these conversations with a little bit of groundwork. And so Gordon, I'm just going to start with you with some terminology. So we titled this talk, Security Alliances in the Indo-Pacific. So let's just get some definitions down. What are alliances and how are they different from partnerships or groupings? And what is this term that we kind of hear keep cropping up over recent years, the Indo-Pacific, and how does that differ from Asia-Pacific?
Well, thank you, Courtney, and thank you, Network 2020. I'm honored to be on here, and I'm particularly honored to be sharing a panel with Eva. This looks forward to having a good conversation here today. Look, for a business community like you have in your network, alliances can mean a lot of things. You can have business alliances or personal alliances, but when you're talking about foreign policy or international relations, it's actually a rather specific definition. It refers to a treaty ally, which is a military treaty. In essence, at its core, it's the willingness of one party to go to war, to shed blood, to defend or protect another party. And so alliances are relatively rare. The United States only has 5 treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific: South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, and Australia. And there's a few others who have different relationships. They're very close, they're strategic partners, etc. But alliances are a slightly different thing. So you'll hear in our conversation today discussion of the Quad, groupings like India, Japan, Australia, United States. That's not a formal alliance. Obviously, those of your audience calling in from NATO will be familiar with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which itself is an alliance. And it's a little bit different than individual bilateral relationships the United States or other countries might have. The Indo-Pacific is a more interesting question. Your audience will quickly ascertain that there's a lot more Arizona than Australia in my accent. I spent 25 years in Washington, D.C. Working on East Asia before I moved to Perth, Western Australia, some 8 years ago. And when I began my professional career, nobody used the term Indo-Pacific. In fact, nobody used the term Asia Pacific. We largely referred to East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Australia was part of this mystical land called Oceania, hanging out by Atlantis somewhere with the South Pacific Islands. And it really wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s, that Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific Islands realized they wanted to be part of this economically vibrant region in East Asia, and they wanted to integrate north. And at the same time, the powerhouse economies of the time, Japan and Korea, wanted to integrate south. And so increasingly, we expanded our definition of the region, and it became the Asia Pacific. And that vocabulary, that framing, that construct ruled for the better part of 25, 30 years until it ran into some limitations. As India grew in power and influence, India was not part of most Asia Pacific organizations. It wasn't part of APEC. It wasn't seen as part of the region. So at its core, Indo-Pacific is really all about how do you incorporate India into the Asia Pacific. And it's not just India, it's actually the confluence of those two great oceans. So there's, success has many fathers. Over the last 5 to 10 years, Indo-Pacific has really become the framing construct. The United States changed the name of its Pacific Command in Hawaii to the Indo-Pacific Command. The Japanese link the Indo-Pacific construct to a speech that Prime Minister Abe gave back in 2007, talking about the confluence of the two oceans. The Indians now have their own origin story for the Indo-Pacific, as do the Australians, who were the first to actually use the term in a government document back in 2013 in the 2013 Defense White Paper. But now the Indo-Pacific really refers to that diagonal between the Indian Ocean and all the trade and energy flows that go through that up into the Pacific. So it's the Indo-Pacific or Asia Pacific plus India.
Wonderful, which points out the fact that we are actually missing a panelist on India, which is something that we had tried to find but unsuccessfully. So so apologies for that omission, but we will talk about the Indo-Pacific regardless, and we can revisit the Indo portion of it a little bit later, perhaps at a future date. So with that, turning to you, Eva, how would you define or describe the current security architecture of the Indo-Pacific, and in what notable ways has it been changing?
Well, thanks a lot, Courtney, and thanks a lot for having me as well. Just to perhaps follow up on what Gordon just said about the Indo-Pacific, I think one core attribute of this new geopolitical construct is that it's become much more inclusive, as opposed to the Asia Pacific being kind of based on these exclusive relationships on the US-led hub and spoke system. Pretty much it's a huge space, of course, with new actors. Gordon said India, but also, well, coming from Europe, I have to say that the Europeans are now part or kind of remotely part of the concept as well. And many more issues, many more security challenges, not just the traditional ones, but also the non-traditional ones that are really much more in focus, actually, as part of this new Indo-Pacific debate. So as a result, we see a much more fragmented or rather multi-layered security architecture in the region. With a superposition of different things. You have the bilateral alliances, the US-led ones, but also other ones. You have the bilateral partnerships between these new actors, Japan, India, Europe, bringing in, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have the pre-existing ASEAN-centered multilateral security structures that have always been there, ASEAN-centered meaning ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summit, et cetera. And on top of it, and that's really a new feature on the regional theater, is this emergence of new, what I call minilateral groupings, trilateral, quadrilateral, you name it. We mentioned AUKUS and Quad, which is in the title of this conversation. But when I say minilateral, I'm talking about these smaller, typically 3 to 6 actors, flexible arrangements that are designed usually to address more specific issues that are usually ignored by either the bilateral partnerships or traditional alliances and the multilateral fora. And this is really a result, and perhaps something that Gordon definitely thought of, but I think it should be really highlighted more. This is a result of this also increasing or an effort to diversify security partnerships for the regional actors in the increasing US-China rivalry. I mean, if there is one feature that really defines the Indo-Pacific discussion today, it is also the US-China binary and the growing strategic competition that really has become has had a polarizing effect on the region. So the need to diversify on the one hand, and on the other, the need to deliver concrete results. Because that has been something that has been quite missing. So you have AUKUS, Quad on the more strategic, higher level strategic spectrum, but you have also the Japan, India, Australia trilateral on supply chain resilience, for instance. And then you have a zillion of smaller local ones, the Mekong region one, et cetera, et cetera. So it's become more complex, if you want.
Thank you. Digging into some of these alliances or groupings in particular, we'll start with a grouping. Gordon, turning to you, the Quad traces its roots back to the 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean, but today it's 4 participants: Japan, the US, India, and Australia. It seems like they have a far broader agenda that involve issues of security, of economics, and health. And increasingly, it seems to be seen as a grouping that's important to the power dynamics in the region vis-a-vis China, as Eva just mentioned. So how has the Quad evolved since 2004, and what impact has it had in the region? And do you see it intensifying in terms of the impact that it can have?
Absolutely. The Quad began, as you suggested, as a quadrilateral security dialogue. And you're right, it was 2004 after the Boxing Day tsunami, and it was just a coordination between India, Japan, the United States, and Australia. It was relatively nascent, relatively small. By 2007, it had become relatively moribund. There was reticence on the part of Australia for fear at that time of offending China. There was reticence in Japan and in India for fear of upsetting China. But in the intervening years, as China's power and influence grew, with that grew concern in other parties in the region and the need to have a strategy to counter China, or to at least respond to the growth and influence of China by working together on areas of shared interest. And so the Quad in that respect was kind of reborn by an increase in cooperation between these 4 countries. I should emphasize here that the Quad is not the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is a region. And as Eva mentioned, it's a very inclusive and expansive region without the clearly defined membership or boundaries, but there's no version of the Indo-Pacific that doesn't include China, right? So the Quad really is a strategy for dealing with challenges in the Indo-Pacific era. In October of last year, just over a year ago, the first ever foreign ministers meeting of the Quad took place in Japan. And then in March of this year, there was the first ever leaders meeting of the Quad. Prior to that, it had been a relatively low-level meeting of coordination between these 2 countries. And in that meeting, the prime ministers, again, of Japan, Australia, the United States, and India agreed to a rather expansive agenda, which interestingly did not include security. It was focused on climate change, on vaccines, on supply chains, on technology, a whole range of other issues that weren't the traditional security alliance issues. And in that context, the most recent meeting that was held, the in-person leaders meeting of the Quad that took place in DC in September of this year, just furthered that level of cooperation. But there is no question that were it not for a half decade of increasingly aggressive behavior on the part of China, that Indian interest, Japanese interest, Australian interest would be very different. So in some respects, it is a response to a much more aggressive and assertive China, and 4 countries working together to figure out how best to secure their interests in that environment.
Thank you. Before I move on to the next question about AUKUS, is there anything, Eva, that you would want to add about Japan vis-a-vis the Quad?
Well, perhaps just that Japan is actually a key player of the Quad, although it is supposed to be a partnership between four equals. And I need to always remind that it is not a US-led initiative. And in fact, Japan was the one who was behind the revival of the Quad in 2017. And in that sense, I think it's interesting to see Japan moving from a rather passive foreign policy role to a much more active one. It's setting the agenda in the Indo-Pacific, and in that sense, it very much promotes the free and open Indo-Pacific vision that Japan stands for. So it kind of it's a force multiplier, if you want, for Japan in the region.
Thank you. That's very good to know. Just shifting gears a little bit to AUKUS, which is the new trilateral security agreement that made waves this fall. Eva, in what ways will it strengthen the UK's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and what is Japan's take on that? I've heard that it's generally welcoming, but not without a feeling of unease. So I'd love for you to expand on that. So both UK and Japan perspectives too.
Well, Japan, since we started on Japan, of course, on the one hand, understands very much the motivations and the drivers behind AUKUS, which again, very much aligns its own interests, whether it's somehow being much more effective in countering some of the negative effects of China's assertiveness, which it does. But on the other hand, and again, it's similar to other partners in the region, it is slightly worried about the short-term impacts of the decision. Because yes, potentially there is a risk of triggering some sort of military, I wouldn't call it arms race, but acceleration of the military buildup in the region. And it is yet another symptom of this hardening US-China rivalry, which again, we need to repeat that it has immediate negative effects on most countries in the region, smaller and middle-sized ones and outside the region. In a way, this is the same feeling in Europe. So Europeans ultimately, despite the initial emotional wave that was triggered by the announcement, that's a different issue. I think ultimately everyone understands the end goal, understands Australia's motivation and agrees with it in principle. But of course, the short-term impacts are a little bit more worrying. UK's position is an interesting one. Everyone keeps talking about Australia and the US because of the defense deal being kind of mostly between the two. But UK has always been a resident power in the region, has always been present in the region as bilateral relationship, is part of the five-power defense arrangements and others. And of course, post-Brexit, it has been very much trying to strengthen its position, and now being an individual standalone country, promote its global Britain foreign policy agenda by strengthening mostly its cooperation with its allies in the United States and Australia. So it's a logical move, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, it presents some economic opportunities for the British industrial defense base. So it's a very logical, understandable move, and then we can perhaps talk more about what it means for the rest of Europe, if you want. But
yes, and perhaps that's something we can get to in the Q&A, because I think obviously France's perspective has caused some diplomatic upheaval. So, but before we get there, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and look at Australia, and Gordon, from your perch in Perth. You referenced earlier that within the Quad, at any rate, Australia had not wanted to do anything that would raise the ire of China, but it seems like perhaps that is changing. And AUKUS has been called a definitive move for the country in the Asia-Pacific region, and it represents the hardening views toward China, and for Australia a major defense upgrade, and it comes from a closer relationship with the US. So what are you seeing? Like, what is the view from Australia on AUKUS, and why did they decide now that it was the time to make such a definitive move?
Yeah, so you're accurate in framing that as hardening views toward China, but if you step back and look at it from a slightly bigger picture, It's actually hardening views in reaction to China. And what I mean by that is, if you really want to understand AUKUS or even the Quad itself, you need to step back and go back to this construct of the Indo-Pacific. I agree very much with Eva early on. It is at its very nature an inclusive and additive construct, right? It's very inclusive. And if you look at what the United States Indo-Pacific strategy is doing, it is essentially strengthening other parties in the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, the US wants a stronger Japan. The US wants a stronger India. The US wants a stronger ASEAN, a stronger Vietnam, a stronger Indonesia. And clearly, as AUKUS indicates, they want a stronger Australia as well. And on top of that, they want a region that actually has other parties at play. You know, France obviously has the second largest EEZ of any country. It's really very much an Indo-Pacific power. As Eva mentioned, so is Britain. Just last month, the Germans had for the first time ever, had a frigate here in the region. You know, the Brits had an aircraft carrier battle group throughout the region. And the interesting thing is, in general, the region has welcomed European interest, American interest, Australian interest, because what it does is it makes this region more complex. Now, there is one party that doesn't like the term Indo-Pacific, and that's China. China prefers G2, you know, a new model of great power relations. They want mano y mano, US versus China. And I personally think that we ought to resist that framing. There are some today that think that Europe should problem China to the Americans. And again, I disagree with that. I believe that in addition to trying to avoid conflict, what we're really trying to do in this region is complicate Chinese decision-making, right? By having Brits and Europeans and Germans and French and Japanese involved here, it's a lot more complicated and it's not so black and white. And that, in my mind, is a good thing for peace. So why do I give you that preamble before talking about AUKUS? Because in the end, AUKUS is a really big deal because the United States is giving the crown jewels of its military technology, nuclear propulsion technology for submarines. You know, and so it says a lot more about the United States than it does Australia, right? It says the United States is willing to give of its power. And again, stepping back for the Indo-Pacific, as other powers grow, the US would never phrase it this way, but as other powers grow in influence, India, ASEAN, Indonesia, Australia, the US's relative power goes down. But the collective power of what Aussies like to call the rules-based order goes up. And that's inherently a good thing, right? It's inherently a good thing. So AUKUS really has to be viewed in that light. It is the United States recognizing that it does not want this to be a G2 competition. It doesn't want this to be a US versus China, and it wants to strengthen partnerships. And obviously the closest and most trusted allies are those Five Eyes countries. And in this case, the very close relationships between Australia, the UK, and the US. I would hesitate to add, however, that it's not just submarines. It's actually a much more comprehensive agreement. It's actually a technology sharing submarines where they basically say the level of interaction, the level of intelligence sharing, the level of technology cooperation is going to go up across the board, saying that we're facing a new reality. We've got to do things differently.
Thank you. Eva, moving over to you. ASEAN has been around for quite some time, about 5 decades, a large intergovernmental organization of 10 Southeast Asian countries. What has been the main promotional purpose of this bloc, and what have been some of their successes, and maybe more importantly, what are some of their limitations? So if you could just give us a walk through ASEAN.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad you mentioned ASEAN, because it's somehow always there, but never there enough, it seems to me. And frankly, ASEAN is key precisely in formulating this alternative narrative to the G2 that Gordon just mentioned. So what is ASEAN? Well, ASEAN is the oldest and definitely the only real example of regional integration in Asia. And at the beginning, and as similar of such projects, it has been always a peace project. It's supposed to be a preventive diplomacy tool from the onset, based on cooperation, dialogue, mutual respect, non-intervention, all the things that are in the ASEAN Charter. It evolved a lot over those 5 decades, from an economic cooperation and trading agreements. We have a free trade zone in the region, people to people, you name it, to a much more political animal that is becoming nowadays. So you see very rudimentary forms of cooperation, including in security, mostly on non-traditional security, but also constabulary issues, humanitarian disaster relief, cyber, maritime security. Of course, it's work in progress. But what is most important about ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific debate is that it's really the glue of the regional architecture. It is, and rules-based order in a way, right? It is the core nucleus, what we call ASEAN-centered security architecture. So you have the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, plus ASEAN East Asia Summit. All of these are formed on ASEAN. So no matter how much we can criticize ASEAN for being slow, for not being flexible enough, for being, all the things that we can reproach to a big multilateral organization, which are true, it is something, ASEAN centrality is something that everyone, including China, agrees on. And that's absolutely important to remind. So often we say, Japan, US, or whoever may tell the direction, but you need a driver. And ASEAN is often supposed to be in the driver's seat. And of course, ASEAN has its own Indo-Pacific outlook, let's not forget. That has been quite actually instrumental to the formulation of more of these visions, outlooks, and strategies that everyone now has, which is again based on cooperation, prosperity. It's a very soft language if you want, but we need ASEAN no matter how we criticize it. It's quite central in the region.
Thank you. And just a reminder to everyone listening, I have a couple of more questions, but then I will be turning to audience questions. So if you'd like, please do put some questions in the Q&A box. We will be getting to them shortly. Gordon, as I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation was because alliances continue to emerge in conversations that I have about strategy within the region, and how to coexist with China's growing clout. And so we've talked about some of these existing alliances and partnerships, but there are others that have not fared as well. There's TPP, and then its latest iteration of the CPTPP come to mind. The US pulled out of the former and is not yet participating in the latter. So when you're looking at this chessboard of alliances and groupings, what would you say the US strategy is regarding its role in the Indo-Pacific, and what are the weak points? And again, if you could comment on the CPTPP question as well, that would be wonderful.
I certainly will. Look, it may seem now, particularly if you've only been paying attention for the last 5 years, that we are in some new type of a Cold War, and that conflict with China is inevitable, and the U.S. is always lined up against China. But that hasn't been the case for the better part of 30 years. In the 25 years I spent in Washington, D.C., it was the U.S. business community that lobbied every year for China to get most favored nations trading status. It was the U.S. and Japanese and Korean business communities that invested so heavily, along with the Europeans internally in China, that wanted China to grow. It was the U.S. and the Europeans and the others that lobbied for China to come into the World Trade Organization, partly because we all believed that as China grew wealthier and progressed economically, it would liberalize politically as well. And the truth is, it did. In 30 years and 40 odd trips over my professional career, every time I go to China, it became more open, right? But there were decisions made. So I'm certainly not someone who believes that the Chinese Communist Party is inherently evil and the Chinese are always evil, and anybody thought that they would be like us or more Western in approach or more democratic or more open were foolish. And that's not true, right? That's the trajectory China was on. But there were decisions made to protect the role of the party. And if you're charitable, right? If you're charitable, you say, look, the Chinese never ignore big problems. They knew that there was a demographic freight train bearing down upon them as a result of the one-child policy. They had a population which, as of 2018, 2020, where the largest segment was ages 50 to 70. They were going to be the first country in the world to grow old before they grew rich. And so they knew that rough days were ahead. The only problem was that they were ruled by a bunch of party hacks whose only solution to these problems was to strengthen the party. And ultimately ruled by a leader who said, well, because the party is weak, I have to strengthen myself. And we've just seen this week, not only has Xi Jinping made himself essentially emperor for life, taken on an unprecedented third term, but over the last 10 years, step by step by step, reversed every element of what we call the Deng Xiaoping consensus, the opening and reform that everybody was encouraging in China, a more vibrant private sector, more openness to international investment, cooperation in a whole range of things. And so in essence, China began to pursue a different direction. So, I mean, even 10 years ago, as I was talking about the Quad, people wanted China to grow, right? But as China grew overly influential and was moving away from international standards and norms, the region began to realize that they needed a strategy to work together to counter Chinese influence. And so going back to the Indo-Pacific, you had two options. You could confront China, or you could figure out a way to lessen their relative power. So I said earlier, the Indo-Pacific lessened US relative power. If you've got a closed system and one power gets more and more powerful, one of your strategies is to increase the size of the system, bring in 1.3 billion Indians, right? And all of a sudden, everybody is less powerful. It's less of a G2, more multipolar, and more of a rules-based order. I would not put the CPTPP or the TPP in that context. The CPTPP, the original Trans-Pacific Partnership, rather, was envisioned as part of a pathway to a free trade agreement of the Asia-Pacific, given the failure of global rounds. And it was in partnership really with the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership. It was directly designed to eventually include China. It was not designed as an anti-China bloc. Now, eventually, as China changed trajectory, people began to say, who's going to write the rules of the road? We want China in. Unfortunately, the United States has become extremely weak on this issue because of its domestic politics. And so when Donald Trump decided to pull out of the TPP as one of his very first official acts back in 2016, I think that was one of the most self-damaging things any US leader has ever done in terms of its role in the region. And so far, excuse me, even though the Biden administration has had great success in restoring American credibility overseas, alliance relationships, American approval ratings overseas, the one area where they do not have a strategy is economic engagement. And so with China now saying they want to join the TPP, with China having joined the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership Agreement, the United States is falling behind, and that's of great concern to other countries in the region, such as ASEAN or Japan or the United States, that wants a little bit more balance in the region. So sorry for the long answer and the harsh voice, but I hope that gives some context.
Nope, that's what we need. There aren't always short answers to these questions, so thank you. Eva, turning to you, particularly when it comes to maritime security, do you think that these partnerships and alliances will be enough to counter China's influence in the region, or will they create more risk of flashpoints?
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. Well, again, I feel like following up a little bit on what Gordon said, because what strikes me is the counter China's influence in your question anyway, because, well, it's extremely difficult to counter China's influence, if you want. One thing we cannot change is geography. And the fact on the ground is that most Southeast Asian countries, but also Japan and Europe and others, are of course, vitally dependent on China. I mean, China is their greatest economic and trading partner, and that's something we cannot change. So countering its influence will be difficult and probably not necessarily what we want. What we're trying to do here is really to counter the negative impacts, or China to abuse its position of power, to put pressure on those countries to gain political support, and to, of course, impede on the country's sovereignty and independence to a certain extent. So that's exactly also what is going on, well, in economic spheres, but also at sea. So one thing we cannot do and don't want to do is to prevent China from existing as a maritime power. No one can do that. China is well on its way to become a major blue water navy. It has all the rights to ply the world seas, and that's in fact the principle of freedom of navigation that we're trying to defend here. And but the goal is to make sure that it does so in respect of international law, and that it does not do so at the expense of other countries' sovereignties and sovereign rights, be it in the region or globally. And that's really what this upholding rule of law is all about. That's all we're talking about. So the key example of China transgressing international law or agreed principles and infringing on other countries' sovereignty is, for instance, the South China Sea or even the East China Sea, which are really the key regional flashpoints and parts of the world that everyone is looking at. And here the answer, unfortunately, is as long as China perceives these alliances as aimed at its containment and ultimately unfair, yes, the tensions are likely to grow, of course. There is another element, which is the sheer number of this presence in those waters. So the more you have actors on the ground, of course, the higher is a risk of clashes, being accidental ones or less accidental, of harassments and collisions that can, or miscommunication that can potentially overspill, that can get out of hands, and it results in a conflict that would have devastating, of course, effects on the littoral states. So it's a double-edged sword. Of course, we need an international community that kind of collectively upholds the rules-based order, and that's exactly, I think, what Gordon was talking about lifting all these ships, and send an extremely strong message to China and to anyone who would, want to transgress this international law to stay within the limits. But of course, there is a short-term risk of escalation that we need to be aware. So I guess an optimistic answer, a very short one. I think it will get probably worse before it hopefully gets better.
Thank you. Thank you both. I will be turning to the Q&A box now because we're getting a lot of good questions in there. Before we do, I just wanted to point our audience to a couple of discussions that we've had in the past. One is in reference to what Gordon was saying about the role of business and what the business community was interested in vis-a-vis China and some of the economic relationship aspects. And we have a great discussion with Dr. Yukon Huang that's on our website, and he delves into that. And then some of what Eva was just talking about in the South China Sea, we had a discussion about that. It's probably a little bit more dated now, but I think that there are still some really interesting pieces in that, and that's on the South China Seas. And that was a wonderful panel that we had in the summer of 2020, I believe. So please do feel free to check those out if you want to go in depth into any more of those topics. So turning to the Q&A box now, a lot of good questions. Gordon, I'll start off with you. We have one from Bruce Crawford, who wants to know, how much, if any, subnational, so looking at like governors, city manager level networking and diplomacy exists underneath the national level alliance structure. So from your perspective, and maybe Eva, you can comment on this as well, are you seeing things outside of the national structure that helps complexify this relationship?
I can speak very clearly about that dynamic here in Australia. Like almost every other country in the region, Australia has a bifurcated series of interests. Economically, it is largely dependent on exports to China of critical materials like coal from the eastern states, LNG, and iron ore from Western Australia. And as a result, governors in those states that have large export industries have tended to be much more favorable to China and much more critical of the federal government's national line than states that haven't had those issues, or the premiers rather from our states here. And so we see that on a daily basis here. Now, having said that, subnational leaders tend to have much more latitude on economic issues and much less latitude, obviously, in areas that are controlled by national governments. So security and diplomacy are generally run by the nation state, not run by the state or provinces on a subnational government. And there is a tension there, but ultimately, even in the case of Australia, so I'll give you a very specific example. The state of Victoria here several years ago decided that they would sign up to a state level Belt and Road Initiative agreement with China, where the national government decided that the country would not do it. And ultimately the state level decision was reversed because the national government has purview over foreign policy and diplomacy and security affairs.
Thank you. Eva, could you please tell us more about the EU's strategy in Indo-Pacific and what is the role of France in the strategy and how does AUKUS affect that, please?
The official title would be the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So I think it gives you already the taste of where this document is heading. It is about promoting cooperation. I mean, I wouldn't go in detail of it, but of course it's been we've waited for a very long time for the strategy to come up. As you can imagine, it's not easy to get 27 member states on board, very different interests on all sides. It has been largely France and then Germany and Netherlands who were the pen holders or initial drivers behind the strategy, but they always pushed a European level of engagement. It has been discussed for a very long time whether to embrace the concept, not embrace the concept, whether to use the terminology. And the hesitance at first was really not to be drawn into the US-China rivalry narrative at all, right? Eventually, it was published, and here the question of AUKUS is pertinent because AUKUS managed to steal the show a little bit because it was published a day before the official publication of the EU strategy. Now, of course, you can imagine many people in Brussels, not just Paris, were not very happy about that. But I wouldn't say that has now, with a little bit of distance, it has a major impact. As I said, there was initial discontent and all the diplomatic measures that we've seen, France recalling ambassadors and all the very strong statements, I think, was a reaction that was proportionate to the disappointment in a way, but it was very much related to the form. It was related to this effect of surprise, of not being consulted, of knowing that the strategy is coming up, and still kind of choosing that moment, to, as I said, steal the show. But ultimately, now that the atmosphere has cooled down, I think everyone agrees that it does not change the EU's or French interests in the region, and actually quite the opposite. I mean, there seems to be an effort to show or be even more active, as a reaction to AUKUS, saying, we will not let ourselves, being set aside. These interests are still there. And while there is perhaps this effort to get back more to these exclusive formations, there is a need for what in Europe we call the third way, which is to play a role in mitigating a little bit this US-China rivalry, and that's really, one of the main messages behind the strategy. I mean, I wouldn't go into details. It's all about working with partners, inclusivity, etc. But really, the third way, I would say, is the key word here.
Yes, yeah, I think that the EU has a very important role to play. Gordon, I'm going to turn this next question to you. We've talked a lot about China's rising power and how a lot of these alliances and groupings are in response to that. I have an interesting question from Nikita Kozhemyakin, and he writes, I strongly don't see any chance China can play equally with the US on the geopolitical stage. So what will be the future of China? do you consider a weak China or a collapse of the PRC as the main goal? The Chinese economy can't last long with such pressure, which will make it more aggressive. So how do you deal with that and make sure war will not be started by chance? And I'm going to add my own questions onto there too, which is, we've been talking a lot about this scenario of a rising China. What happens if the reverse happens, if something bad happens to China, economically or whatnot? What are the roles of these alliances and groupings in that situation?
So I gave a hint of my reaction in my earlier response, and why I think China is doing what it's doing right now. I have long been far more concerned about Chinese weakness than I have been concerned about Chinese strength. And I often say somewhat flippantly that one person I am sure that agrees with me is Xi Jinping. If you look at every action coming out of China in the last 5 years, the crackdown in Hong Kong, the worried about some students with yellow umbrellas, banning Winnie the Pooh cartoons, right? The crackdown in the Uyghurs themselves, they all smack not of confidence and growth, but of concern and worry about trying to hold things together. Now, having said that, I don't think the objective of the Quad or the U.S. alliance systems or AUKUS is in any way, shape, or form to try to encourage the collapse of China. Nobody wants that, right? We've got this deeply integrated economy that we want China to continue to grow economically. We want the well-being of their people. And anybody who suggests otherwise ignores what the United States and Europe did for 30 years to help facilitate the growth and economic progress of China. The challenge is, what we want is a China, and again, and Eva really phrased this very well, that does not abuse the international system. So let me just take and throw in a little bit of philosophy here, right? You go back to Thucydides. Everybody these days want to talk about the Thucydides trap, but I'll go back even further. When he was talking about Athens demanding that I think it was the Melians give up, surrender, or be killed. He responded, just says, "The strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must." Right? That was his phrase. Right? In a core, the Indo-Pacific is a construct. The rules-based order, AUKUS, TPP, the international rules-based system are all about one thing. They're about making sure that we don't live in a world where might makes right, that we don't live in a world where the weak do what they will and the strong suffer what they must. That's what the UN is about. That's what the post-World War II global order is about. And candidly, China in recent years, out of its own paranoia about its own system, has been resisting that system because of its own domestic concerns. And so again, I don't see us as being allied against China or trying to contain China. Instead, I think we ought to frame this, not G2, but how do we strengthen the rules-based order? How do we strengthen the international system? And that's one thing the Europeans and the Canadians and the Indians and the Japanese could agree upon, because it's really not US versus China. You try to find me a country in the world today that isn't concerned about Chinese activities, right? Really, the Canadians, right? The nicest people on the planet, the Indonesians, everybody, right? The Indians, right? It just tells you there's something more fundamental afoot here.
Thank you, Gordon. That was a great answer to a very good question. So Eva, turning to Japan now. They have been promoting their free and open Indo-Pacific framework in their diplomatic relations at a broad level. So this is a question I'm pulling from the Q&A box, including with some Eastern European countries. Could you please elaborate more on what you think was Japan's role, if there was one, in lobbying for this European Indo-Pacific framework?
Yes. So, okay, Japanese lobbying, well, it would be a little bit far-fetched, but put it simple, behind the EU's thinking before the strategy really came up, were both in external and internal drivers. The internal ones were the French, were the Germans, were the Dutch. Behind the external ones, there would be, well, an increasing perception of the China threat on the one hand, which suddenly became much more plausible in Europe. It was not just the distant fact. It was the US, it was the kind of relative, you wouldn't say a relative decline, but at a certain time, the uncertainty of the US security guarantee, which is something that really binds a lot of the US allies together. And that's one of the dynamic behind the EU-Japan rapprochement as well. And finally, yes, it was also in reaction to our partners in Asia. Japan, Korea, India are long-standing strategic partners at a certain level. I mean, it depends how you define strategic of the European Union. And this relationship is also constituting some of the pillars of the strategy. Now, I think this it's really important to notice, and anyone who has been following the region since 2016 has seen the reinforcement of this bilateral relationship kind of between the US allies, driven by the same goal, by the same concerns, which was the US relative withdrawal from the region at a certain point in time. And that still persists in the European strategic thinking. And I wouldn't go as far as calling for, strategic autonomy of Europe, whatever that means. It means very different things to different people. But really the realization that we cannot 100% rely on the US security umbrella and that we need to put our act together was really one of the drivers behind the European involvement in the region, but also behind the Japanese thinking, reaching out much more to Europeans in achieving the common goals. Let's see, there's actually quite a lot of similarities between the Japanese free and open Indo-Pacific concept and the European vision, but it's also the same reason behind the rapprochement between Japan and India, or Japan and Australia. So yeah, I wouldn't say Japan lobbying, but definitely a rapprochement between Europe and Japan, as much as it was with Japan and other partners.
So Courtney, can I just echo that, just to fully agree with Eva and emphasize it? This hypercharging of the Indo-Pacific as a construct was in part due to those two trends. The growing concern about the rise of China and its influence system, and at the same time, as Eva says, growing concern about the reliability of the United States, particularly during the Trump era. And even since then, they're just, the lack of a US economic strategy means that other countries realize that they need to be more proactive, which is exactly why Australia, Japan, Canada, India, ASEAN are much more proactive. And in the end, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I think it's probably a good thing.
Thank you. One question, I'll put this to you, Eva, first, and then Gordon, please, I'd love your thoughts on it as well. And this is from Kyle Marston, who asks, one of the saddest and most striking issues I keep hearing about in the Indo-Pacific is China's use of little blue men or informal maritime militias in the continued maritime-based slavery that's been going on, especially for refugees from conflict regions in Southeast Asia. Is this an issue that our panelists think will be ameliorated by AUKUS or one of these other groupings?
No, I would tend to agree that's an extremely sad feature. I mean, of course, the slavery issue is one, and that's I would, to connect it to AUKUS, I think is a little bit. I'm afraid that AUKUS is really not designed for that, to deal with that sort of issues. But that doesn't diminish the sadness and the importance of these issues. So slavery on ships and the Rohingya refugees is actually one. The role of maritime militias, especially in the South China Sea, is a slightly different subject that's more related to really China's assertiveness and the use of these hybrid methods and what we call gray zones that are somehow basically managing to achieve its goals through non-military means. But the reality on the ground, of course, is a dire one. There are thousands, hundreds and thousands of fishermen that are that fall victim of this harassment, sometimes deadly clashes, etc. And now in the South China Sea, there are, I mean, it is part of the issues that are being looked at by international actors in general. So when there is all sorts of negotiations or roundtables, of course, it's constantly brought up. And it's difficult to address those because it's not well, that's why China is using them. Of course, it's not part of the military, it's not part of the PLA, it's not part of the Ministry of Interior, it's part of the fishing agency. So it's very difficult to engage the actors. On the other hand, on the other side, and it is an issue in progress. The issue of slavery, I guess, it's part of those non-traditional security issues that are extremely sad, but are and will be hopefully dealt more by ASEAN itself, because that's a much more localized feature in the Gulf of Thailand and off the coast of Bangladesh. ASEAN should definitely look into the issues with the help of the UN, the right tools at the UN level, I would believe. But unfortunately, the alliance systems are designed to much higher strategic questions, and these remain overlooked.
Thank you, Eva. Oh, Gordon.
I agree with Eva, and that this is really not the initial or primary focus of AUKUS, at least in the short term. But this question does highlight that broader question that I was trying to outline. If you're talking about the liberal international system or the rules-based order, that's precisely what you're talking about, right? The agreement, to have a UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, and to have a tribunal that comes down with a ruling that says China, wrongfully took over Filipino territory, and have China then to ignore that ruling, because they believe might makes right. That's not where we want to. So the international rules-based order is going to be saying, look, we stand against slavery. We want transparency in supply chains, right? And so that's really what we're talking about. And whether it is activities in the Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, whether it is activities with the Rohingya or other kind of, nameless and highly unfortunate slaves in maritime slave, those are all highly important things that can only be addressed multilaterally through a rules-based order, which again emphasizes the importance of all these countries working together in resisting this notion of making it all about China versus the US, because those things will never rise to that level of importance in the process. And again, let me just add one final comment. I know it may sound like I'm kind of China bashing here in this problem, but the reality is, just to give a specific example today, these matter for Chinese, right? The fact that in the last week, we've had this very high profile Chinese international tennis star who criticized, a party member for sexual abuse or sexual harassment, who's now disappeared, right? That shouldn't happen in a rules-based order, right? To someone high profile like that. But in the current China, that happens. 10 years ago, it might have been very different, right?
Yes, Eva, yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's great.
And I agree, of course, with Gordon, but just to get back to the slavery issues, I think one thing that, alliances are there for something, and that's, but there are so many things, and that can be done on the everyday, and that need to be done on the everyday basis. And these are the small security issues, if you want to, call them. And it's all about this functional cooperation, because fighting, transnational crime, because this is criminal networks that we're talking about. And I'm not talking about China this one, I'm talking about criminal networks, whether you talk about people smuggling, drug smuggling, piracy, whatever. These are reasonably, they're sad, they're important, but they're doable. These are solvable issues that they have nothing to do with China or the US. They have just to do about better police cooperation, fighting corruption, because that's and that's what a lot of NGOs are actually trying to do in the region, and that really can be done by just providing sufficient capacity to local law enforcement agencies, police, and working harder on border control with Thailand, with Bangladesh, etc., etc. So these are solvable issues. In a way, they're important. They're not visible enough. They should be more visible. But that's where we should start, because as we will be talking endlessly about the US-China rivalry and the big philosophical questions and the kind of risk of a third world war, whether it's here already or how we're going to get there. But while we are talking about this, there are people dying and every day on ships, etc. And I think, and frankly, and that's also something that is behind the European approach, is getting the hands dirty and talking about and doing something about these functional security issues.
Thank you both. So yeah, increased emphasis on the rules-based order seems like a very good place to wrap up. Thank you both, Gordon, especially. I know I'm not quite sure what time it is where you are, but I know it's very, very late. So thank you for staying up with us. Eva, thank you so much. You've both been fantastic. Everyone in the audience, phenomenal questions. I'm so sorry I couldn't get to them all. It was a fantastic conversation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Great honor.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. And our next, do we have a next event, Brian? Is that something we've got coming up? I don't even know what day it is. I know we're heading toward Thanksgiving. We do have a member-only briefing on November 22nd with Bernard Heikel on Saudi Arabia and the balance of power in the Middle East. So if you are a member, we hope you will join us. If you're not a member, we hope you will become one. This should be a really interesting conversation. So with that, thank you all. Have a wonderful day, evening, wherever you are, and let's keep our eyes on the broader alliances. So thank you and take care. Bye-bye.